The morning sun barely broke through the thick clouds over Rattlesnake Army Air Base in Arizona as Staff Sergeant Dorothy Dot Winters walked across the dusty tarmac. Her boots kicked up small clouds of red dirt with each step. At 24 years old, she stood just 5 feet 3 inches tall, with dark hair pinned neatly beneath her service cap and eyes that seemed to see everything at once. Dot had arrived at Rattlesnake 3 weeks earlier, transferred from a training facility in Texas. She wasn't a pilot or a navigator. She was a gunnery instructor, one of only a handful of women in the entire Army Air Forces who held that position. The year was 1943, and while women were finally being allowed to serve their country in meaningful ways, not everyone was happy about it. "Well, well, well, look what the cat dragged in." The voice belonged to Master Sergeant Frank Holloway, a thick-necked man with a permanent scowl etched into his weathered face. He stood near one of the massive B-17 Flying Fortress bombers, arms crossed over his barrel chest. 3 other male instructors flanked him, all watching Dot with expressions ranging from amusement to outright hostility. Dot stopped a respectful distance away and saluted crisply. "Reporting for duty, Master Sergeant." Holloway didn't return the salute. Instead, he spat tobacco juice onto the ground near her feet. "You know what I think about women playing soldier, Winters? I think it's a waste of time, a waste of resources, and a waste of a perfectly good uniform." The other men chuckled. One of them, a younger sergeant named Burke, spoke up. "My wife can barely handle a can opener. No offense, ma'am, but how's a woman supposed to teach men how to shoot 50 caliber machine guns from 30,000 feet? Dot had heard it all before. Every base, every training ground, every hangar. The insults changed slightly, but the sentiment remained the same. She kept her face neutral, her voice steady. "The same way anyone else does, Sergeant Burke, through knowledge, experience, and dedication to keeping our boys alive up there." Holloway stepped closer, trying to use his size to intimidate her. "You want to know what the real problem is with tail gunners, little lady? It ain't the guns. It ain't the training. It's that the enemy comes at them too fast, and by the time they get a bead on the target, it's already past them or blown them to bits. But you wouldn't know nothing about that, sitting safe in some classroom back in Texas." Something flickered in Dot's eyes, but she kept her composure. "Actually, Master Sergeant, I've been studying that exact problem. The difficulty isn't just reaction time. It's the perception delay caused by—" "Nobody asked you, Winters." Holloway cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Here's how things are going to work. You're going to sit in that office over there, file paperwork, and stay out of the way of real instructors doing real work. You understand me?" Dot's jaw tightened. She wanted to tell him about her research, about the solution she'd been developing for months, but she knew that pushing back now would only make things worse. These men weren't ready to listen. Not yet. "I understand, Master Sergeant." She saluted again. This time Holloway lazily returned it, dismissed. As Dot walked toward the small office building, she could hear their laughter behind her. Burke's voice carried across the tarmac. "Did you see her face? Probably going to run home crying to Mommy." Inside the cramped office, Dot sat at a metal desk covered with incident reports and training schedules. The room smelled of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. She pulled a worn notebook from her bag, the same one she'd been carrying for 8 months. Its pages were filled with diagrams, calculations, and notes written in her precise handwriting. The problem was real, and it was killing American airmen. B-17 tail gunners faced an almost impossible task. Enemy fighters, particularly the swift German Messerschmitts, attacked from behind at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour. The tail gunner sat in a cramped compartment, peering through a small window, trying to track these fast-moving targets with heavy machine guns. By the time the gunner spotted an enemy plane, calculated the lead time, and fired, the target had often already changed position. The statistics were grim. Tail gunners accounted for less than 15% of enemy kills, despite being in the most vulnerable position on the bomber. Worse, they were among the most likely to be killed or seriously wounded. Dot had read every after-action report she could get her hands on. The pattern was always the same: too slow to react, too late to fire effectively. But Dot had an idea. It had come to her 6 months ago while she was teaching basic marksmanship. She'd noticed how difficult it was for students to hit moving targets when they only had a forward view. But when she'd set up a simple mirror system that let them see the target approaching from a wider angle, their accuracy improved dramatically. The principle was simple: peripheral vision and early warning. If a tail gunner could see enemy aircraft approaching from a wider field of view, they'd have precious extra seconds to prepare, aim, and fire. Those seconds could mean the difference between life and death. She'd spent months developing the concept, working with an optician back in Texas to create a specialized mirror system. The design used carefully angled mirrors mounted outside the tail gunner's compartment, reflecting a wider view into a small display inside. It was elegantly simple, requiring no electronics, no power source, just precisely positioned mirrors and physics. Dot had tested the prototype at the Texas facility with ground-based simulations. The results had been remarkable. Gunners using her mirror system showed a 60% improvement in target acquisition time and nearly tripled their accuracy scores. She documented everything meticulously, including testimonials from the test gunners who'd praised the system enthusiastically. But when she'd presented her findings to her commanding officer in Texas, he'd patted her on the head like a child and told her it was interesting, but not practical for field implementation. 2 weeks later, she'd been transferred to Rattlesnake, effectively silencing her. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. A young private entered, barely old enough to shave, with a folder in his hands. "Excuse me, ma'am. Master Sergeant Holloway wanted you to process these transfer requests." Dot took the folder. "Thank you, Private. What's your name?" "Miller, ma'am. Private James Miller." "Are you training to be a gunner, Private Miller?" The young man's face brightened. "Yes, ma'am. I ship out to flight school next month, going to be a waist gunner on a B-17, God willing." Dot studied his eager face, so young and full of hope. He had no idea what he was heading into. The life expectancy of a B-17 gunner over Europe was measured in missions, not years. Each time they went up, there was roughly a 1 in 4 chance they wouldn't come back. "Do you know anything about the tail gunner position, Private?" Miller shifted his weight. "A bit, ma'am. Everyone says it's the toughest job on the plane. The Germans like to come in from behind, and our boys in the tail have a hard time stopping them." "What if I told you there was a way to make it easier? To give tail gunners a better chance of seeing the enemy coming and hitting their targets?" The private's eyes widened with interest. "Is there, ma'am?" Before Dot could answer, Holloway's voice boomed from outside. "Miller, get your rear end out here. We've got planes to maintain." "Coming, Master Sergeant." Miller gave Dot an apologetic look and hurried out. Dot returned to her notebook, running her finger over a detailed sketch of the mirror assembly. She knew her system worked. She'd proven it. But without the support of her superiors, without even the opportunity to demonstrate it, her innovation would remain just another ignored idea in a forgotten notebook. The afternoon dragged on. Dot processed paperwork, organized files, and listened to the sounds of real training happening outside her window. She watched as Holloway and the other instructors put young gunners through their paces, teaching them the standard techniques that Dot knew were inadequate. As the sun began to set, painting the Arizona sky in shades of orange and purple, Dot made a decision. She couldn't force these men to listen to her. She couldn't make them take her seriously through argument or pleading. But maybe, just maybe, she could show them something they couldn't ignore. She would need help, though, and she would need to be smart about it. Going over Holloway's head would only make him more hostile. But if she could find a way to demonstrate her system unofficially, to prove its worth in a way that couldn't be dismissed, then perhaps even these stubborn men would have to admit she was right. The question was how and with whom. The Arizona nights were cold, despite the scorching daytime heat. Dot sat in her small quarters, a converted storage room in the women's barracks, studying her notes by lamplight. She'd been at Rattlesnake for nearly a month now, and her frustration grew with each passing day. During that time, she'd watched 3 training accidents. One gunner had been injured when his weapon jammed during a practice drill. Another had nearly been thrown from his position during a rough landing. And just yesterday, a training aircraft had returned with bullet holes from a mock combat exercise gone wrong. The holes were in the tail section, exactly where an enemy fighter would have targeted. Each incident reinforced what Dot already knew. The current training methods weren't enough. Young men were being sent into combat without the tools or techniques they needed to survive. A soft knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Private Miller standing in the hallway, looking nervous and excited at the same time. "Private Miller, it's past lights out. What are you doing here?" "I'm sorry, ma'am. I know I shouldn't be here, but I couldn't stop thinking about what you said. about making things easier for tail gunners. He glanced down the hallway to make sure they were alone. My brother, Tommy, he's a tail gunner on a B-17 in England. He's flown 8 missions so far. His last letter said they lost their tail gunner on the previous crew, shot down before he could even fire a shot. Dot's expression softened. I'm sorry about his crewmate. Your brother must be very brave. He's terrified, ma'am. He won't say it directly, but I can read between the lines. And now I'm training to do the same job, and honestly, ma'am, I'm scared too. Miller's voice cracked slightly. If you really have something that could help, I want to know about it. I want to help if I can. Dot studied the young man's face. He couldn't have been more than 19. She thought about all the regulations she'd be breaking, all the ways this could go wrong. But she also thought about Miller's brother and all the other brothers, sons, and fathers sitting in tail gun positions over Europe, fighting an enemy they could barely see coming. Come in, Private, and close the door. Miller entered, and Dot spread her notebook open on the small desk. What I'm about to show you is unofficial. Master Sergeant Holloway hasn't approved it, and technically I'm not supposed to be working on anything except paperwork. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am. But I believe this could save lives. Your brother's life, your life, and I need someone willing to help me prove it. Dot pointed to her diagrams. The problem with tail gunnery is simple. By the time you see the enemy, it's almost too late. Your field of vision is limited, your reaction time is compressed, and you're trying to track a target moving at incredible speeds. Miller leaned in, studying the sketches. So what's the solution? Peripheral vision and early warning. Dot pulled out a more detailed drawing. I've designed a mirror system that mounts outside the tail compartment. These mirrors are angled precisely to reflect a wider field of view into a small display inside the compartment. The tail gunner can see enemy aircraft approaching from angles that would normally be blind spots. It gives them several extra seconds to prepare, acquire the target, and fire. That's brilliant, ma'am. It's only brilliant if it works in real conditions. I tested it on the ground in Texas with positive results, but I need to demonstrate it here with actual aircraft and realistic scenarios. Dot looked at Miller seriously. I need access to a plane and a gunner willing to try the system. Can you help me with that? Miller hesitated. Master Sergeant Holloway would have both our hides if he found out. He would, but consider the alternative. You ship out next month with standard training that we both know isn't adequate. Wouldn't you rather have every possible advantage? The young private made his decision. What do you need me to do? Over the next week, Dot and Miller worked in secret. Miller had befriended one of the mechanics, a corporal named Jackson who had access to the aircraft hangars at night. Jackson, it turned out, had lost his younger brother over Germany just 3 months earlier. When Miller explained what Dot was working on, Jackson agreed to help without hesitation. If this could save even one crew, Jackson had said, it's worth the risk. The three of them worked after dark when most of the base was asleep. Dot had brought the prototype mirror assembly from Texas, carefully packed in her footlocker. It was a modest affair, made from polished metal mirrors, adjustable brackets, and a simple mounting system. Nothing high-tech, nothing that required special manufacturing, just good design and sound physics. They chose a B-17 that was grounded for minor maintenance, a plane that wouldn't be missed for a few nights. Dot carefully installed the mirror assembly on the tail section, adjusting angles with precision, taking measurements with a borrowed surveying tool. Miller and Jackson acted as lookouts and assistants, passing tools and materials. How do you know all this stuff, ma'am? Jackson asked one night as Dot made minute adjustments to a mirror angle. The mathematics, the optics, all of it. Dot smiled as she worked. My father was an optician. He had a shop in Michigan. I grew up grinding lenses and learning about how light behaves. When other girls were playing with dolls, I was calculating focal lengths and refraction angles. Your dad must be proud of you, ma'am. He passed away when I was 16, but yes, I think he would be proud. Dot secured the final bracket. There, let's test the sight lines. Miller climbed into the tail gunner position, while Dot stood outside with a flashlight. She moved through various approach angles, calling out positions while Miller confirmed what he could see in the mirror display. I can see you, ma'am, even when you're way off to the side. Miller's excitement was evident in his voice. This is amazing. It's like having eyes in the back of your head. They ran through dozens of test positions, and each time the results were the same. The mirror system provided a significantly expanded field of view without obstructing the gunner's primary sight line. It was everything Dot had hoped for and more. But they still needed to test it in realistic conditions, and that's where things got complicated. "We need a moving target," Dot explained as the three of them sat in the hangar speaking in low voices. "Something that simulates an enemy fighter making an attack run. Without that, all I have is a theory and some anecdotal evidence. I need hard data." "How are we supposed to arrange that, ma'am?" Miller asked. "It's not like we can just take a B-17 up for a joyride." Jackson rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "There's a training exercise scheduled for next week. Simulated combat runs with P-51 fighters playing the role of enemy aircraft. The B-17s fly in formation, and the P-51s make mock attack runs. Gunnery crews track them and simulate firing, but no live ammunition." "That's perfect," Dot said. "But how do we get my system on one of those planes without authorization?" "Leave that to me," Jackson said. "I'm part of the maintenance crew that preps the planes for training flights. I can install your system the night before and remove it right after. As long as nobody looks too closely, we should be fine." It was risky. If they were caught, all three of them would face disciplinary action, possibly even court-martial. But Dot thought about Miller's brother, about the young men she'd watched train with inadequate tools, about the statistics that showed tail gunners dying at alarming rates. "Let's do it," she said. The next few days were tense. Dot continued her paperwork duties while secretly coordinating with Miller and Jackson. They identified which B-17 would be used in the exercise, confirmed the flight crew, and verified that the tail gunner position would be manned by Miller himself, who had recently qualified for training flights. Master Sergeant Holloway remained oblivious, still treating Dot with dismissive contempt. During a briefing for the training exercise, he made a point of mocking her in front of the other instructors. "Well, if it isn't our lady file clerk. Tell me, Winters, have you learned anything useful yet? Maybe how to make a decent cup of coffee?" The other men laughed. Dot kept her expression neutral. "I'm learning every day, Master Sergeant." "Good, good. You keep learning how to stay out of the way, and we'll all get along just fine." Dot said nothing, but inside she was counting the hours until the training exercise. Soon, she thought, soon they'd all see. The night before the exercise, Jackson installed Dot's mirror system on the designated B-17. Dot supervised, making final adjustments by flashlight. Miller stood guard, his heart pounding every time he heard a sound in the darkness. "It's perfect," Dot finally said, stepping back to admire her work. The mirrors were barely noticeable, just small additions to the already complex exterior of the bomber. Unless someone knew what to look for, they'd never spot them. "Tomorrow's the day," Miller said. "I'm nervous, ma'am." "You'll do fine, Private. Just remember what we practiced. Use the mirror display to track the P-51s as they approach. Note how much earlier you can see them compared to your normal field of view. I'll be monitoring from the ground with binoculars and a stopwatch. We'll have concrete data on reaction time improvements." "And if Master Sergeant Holloway finds out?" Dot smiled grimly. "Then we better make sure the results are too impressive to ignore." The next morning dawned clear and bright. Dot positioned herself at the edge of the airfield with her binoculars, stopwatch, and notebook. Around her, other instructors and officers gathered to observe the training exercise. Holloway stood nearby, loudly critiquing everything he saw. "Watch this, gentlemen," he announced. "This is how you separate the men from the boys. Those P-51s are going to come screaming in, and we'll see which of our greenhorns have what it takes." The B-17s taxied onto the runway, their massive Wright Cyclone engines thundering. Dot found the plane with her system installed and focused her binoculars on the tail section. She could just barely make out Miller's silhouette in the gunner's compartment. The bombers took off in formation, climbing into the Arizona sky. At 10,000 feet, they leveled off and began their training circuit. Somewhere above them, the P-51 Mustangs waited to begin their mock attack runs. Dot's hands trembled slightly as she held the binoculars. Everything depended on the next few minutes. The radio crackled to life on the observation tower, where Holloway and several other senior officers monitored the exercise. Dot had positioned herself close enough to hear, but far enough away to avoid drawing attention. "Blue leader to ground control, beginning first attack run." The voice belonged to Captain Reeves, one of the P-51 pilots. Dot raised her binoculars, her stopwatch ready. The P-51s would approach from the sun, a classic enemy tactic. The tail gunners in the B-17 formation would have to spot them, track them, and simulate defensive fire. It was the same exercise these young men had been running for weeks, with mixed results. There, someone shouted. The P-51s were visible now, silver specks diving toward the bomber formation. They came fast, exactly as German fighters would in real combat. Dot watched her plane specifically, the one with Miller in the tail gun position. She started her stopwatch the moment the P-51s began their approach. Through her binoculars, she could see Miller moving in his compartment, already tracking the incoming aircraft. The other tail gunners in the formation were slower to react, their gun barrels swinging around as they searched for targets. But Miller's guns were moving smoothly, following the P-51's approach with confidence. Guns tracking, came Miller's voice over the radio. Each gunner was supposed to call out when they had acquired the target. Miller's call came a full 3 seconds before any other tail gunner. The P-51s screamed past the formation, pulling up and away. It was a simulated attack run, but Dot's stopwatch told her everything she needed to know. Miller had acquired the target 50% faster than the baseline times from previous exercises. "Second run coming in from low 6 o'clock, Captain Reeves announced. Again, the P-51s dove toward the bombers. This time they approached from below and behind, even harder to spot. But again, Miller's guns were tracking early. His voice came over the radio, calm and confident. "Target acquired, firing solution set." Holloway frowned, listening to the radio chatter. "Who's in the tail gun of Baker 2? He was referring to Miller's plane. An assistant checked the roster. "Private Miller, sir." "Miller, that green kid who just qualified?" Holloway's frown deepened. "His reaction times are way ahead of everyone else. What's he doing different?" Dot said nothing, but her heart raced. The exercise continued for another 20 minutes, with multiple attack runs from various angles. Each time, Miller's performance exceeded the other gunners by significant margins. He was spotting targets earlier, tracking them more smoothly, and maintaining better firing solutions. When the planes finally landed, Holloway was waiting on the tarmac, his face a mixture of confusion and suspicion. The crews climbed out, exhausted but exhilarated. Miller emerged from the tail section, his face flushed with excitement. "Private Miller," Holloway barked, "front and center." Miller hurried over, snapping to attention. "Yes, Master Sergeant." "Your performance up there was unusual, suspiciously good, in fact. You want to tell me what's going on?" Before Miller could answer, Dot stepped forward. Her stomach was in knots, but she kept her voice steady. "Master Sergeant, Private Miller's performance was enhanced by a modified mirror system I installed on his aircraft. The system provides an expanded field of view, allowing the tail gunner to spot approaching targets several seconds earlier than standard equipment allows." Holloway's face turned red. "You did what?" "I installed a prototype mirror system that I designed. The system improves target acquisition time by approximately 50 to 60% and significantly enhances tracking accuracy. Today's exercise provided real-world data supporting my previous ground tests." The other instructors gathered around now, drawn by the commotion. Burke, the sergeant who'd mocked Dot on her first day, spoke up. "You modified military aircraft without authorization. That's a court-martial offense, Winters." "I'm aware of the regulations, Sergeant Burke. However, I'm also aware that our current tail gunnery training has a success rate of less than 15% in actual combat, and that tail gunners have one of the highest casualty rates of any position on a bomber crew. My system can change that." Holloway stepped closer, his voice dangerously low. "You think you can just go around military protocol because you have some bright idea? You think you know better than men who have been training gunners for years?" "I think the data speaks for itself, Master Sergeant." Dot pulled her notebook from her bag and opened it to the day's observations. "Private Miller's average target acquisition time today was 3.2 seconds. The average for the other tail gunners was 5.8 seconds. That 2.6-second advantage could mean the difference between shooting down an enemy fighter or being shot down yourself." "Let me see that." An older voice cut through the tension. Colonel Harrison, the base commander, had arrived unnoticed. He was a lean man in his 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes. He'd flown combat missions in the previous war and commanded respect from everyone on the base. Dot handed him her notebook. Colonel Harrison studied it carefully, flipping through pages of calculations, diagrams, and data. The tarmac was silent except for the wind and the cooling engines of the landed aircraft. Finally, the colonel looked up. "Sergeant Winters, you violated multiple regulations by installing unauthorized equipment on military aircraft." "Yes, sir, I did." "You also worked outside your assigned duties and conducted unsanctioned tests." "Yes, sir." "And you enlisted personnel to assist you in these violations." Dot's jaw tightened. "Private Miller and Corporal Jackson volunteered to help because they believe in the mission, sir. If there's to be punishment, it should fall on me alone." Colonel Harrison's expression was unreadable. "Master Sergeant Holloway, get the maintenance crew to remove Sergeant Winters's equipment from that aircraft immediately. I want it in my office in 1 hour. Sergeant Winters, you'll report to my office at the same time. Dismissed." The colonel walked away, leaving Dot standing among hostile faces. Holloway looked triumphant. "Well, Winters, I hope you enjoyed your little experiment. You're going to spend the rest of the war in a military prison, I expect." Dot said nothing. She'd known the risks. She'd broken the rules, and now she'd face the consequences. But as she walked back to her quarters, she allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction. Her system worked. She'd proven it. Even if they threw her in prison, she'd documented everything. Someday, someone would read her notes and understand what she'd discovered. An hour later, Dot stood at attention in Colonel Harrison's office. The mirror assembly sat on his desk, carefully disassembled and laid out. The colonel studied each component, occasionally picking one up to examine it more closely. "Sit down, Sergeant," he finally said. Dot sat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. "I've reviewed your notes. I've also spoken with Private Miller and Corporal Jackson, as well as the maintenance chief and several other personnel." The colonel leaned back in his chair. "You've put me in a difficult position, Sergeant Winters." "I understand, sir." "Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, I have a soldier who flagrantly violated regulations, who showed complete disregard for the chain of command, and who endangered military property and personnel with unauthorized modifications." He paused. "I also have a soldier who may have solved one of the most pressing problems facing our bomber crews." Dot looked up surprised. Colonel Harrison continued, "I've been in the Army for 30 years, Sergeant. I've seen good ideas die because of stubborn officers, and I've seen bad ideas nearly win wars because someone with stars on their collar refused to admit they were wrong. Your mirror system is simple, effective, and based on sound principles. More importantly, it works." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet." The colonel's expression hardened. "You still violated regulations. I can't just overlook that, no matter how good your intentions were. But I also can't ignore the potential value of your innovation." He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the airfield. "I'm going to give you a choice, Sergeant Winters. Option 1, I write you up for unauthorized modification of military equipment. You'll face a court-martial, probably receive a dishonorable discharge, and your system will be quietly buried in some filing cabinet. Option 2, you submit a formal proposal for your mirror system through proper channels. I'll personally ensure it reaches the right people at right field and the Army Air Force's technical command. But in exchange, you agree to work within military protocol from this point forward. No more midnight installations, no more secret tests." Dot considered this carefully. "Sir, if I submit through proper channels, what guarantee do I have that my proposal won't be buried anyway? With respect, the military establishment hasn't been particularly receptive to innovations from female personnel." Colonel Harrison smiled grimly. "You're right, they haven't. But here's what you don't know. I've been looking for a way to shake things up. The casualty rates among bomber crews are unacceptable, and the tactics and equipment we're using aren't adequate. Your system represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need. I can't promise they'll approve it, but I can promise they'll see it and take it seriously. And if they reject it, then at least you tried through proper channels, and you'll still have your rank, your position, and the opportunity to continue serving. Sometimes, Sergeant, fighting within the system is harder than fighting against it, but it's also more effective in the long run." Dot thought about this. She thought about Miller's brother in England, about all the young men she'd watched train, about the faces in bomber crew photographs that would never grow old. She thought about her father, who'd always taught her that innovation meant nothing if you couldn't get people to use it. "I'll submit the formal proposal, sir." "Good, you'll have full access to base resources for documentation, testing, and development. Master Sergeant Holloway will be instructed to provide any support you need." "Sir, Master Sergeant Holloway has made it clear that he doesn't believe women should be serving in these roles. I'm not sure he'll be cooperative." Colonel Harrison's smile was cold. "Master Sergeant Holloway will follow orders, or he'll find himself transferred to a nice quiet post in Alaska. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear, sir." Over the next 2 weeks, Dot worked around the clock on her formal proposal. She compiled data from her Texas tests, analyzed the results from the training exercise, and created detailed technical drawings of the mirror system. She wrote performance specifications, cost estimates, and implementation guidelines. Private Miller and Corporal Jackson assisted her, now with official approval. Other personnel, intrigued by word of her innovation, stopped by to offer suggestions or simply to see what the fuss was about. Slowly, grudgingly, some of the skepticism began to fade. But not everyone was convinced. Master Sergeant Holloway made his opposition clear from the start. Despite Colonel Harrison's orders, he did everything he could to slow Dot's progress without technically disobeying. Equipment requests took days to process. Personnel she needed were suddenly assigned to other duties. Technical documentation went missing. "I'm following orders, Sergeant Winters," Holloway would say with a thin smile. "But you have to understand we have training operations to run. Your little project can't take priority over preparing men for combat." Dot refused to let his obstruction derail her work. When he delayed equipment requests, she borrowed tools from sympathetic mechanics. When personnel were reassigned, she worked longer hours to compensate. When documentation disappeared, she rewrote it from memory and her notes. But the constant interference wore on her. She was sleeping only 4 hours a night, skipping meals, pushing herself to exhaustion. The other female personnel on base noticed and worried about her. "You need to slow down," urged Lieutenant Sarah Chen, one of the few other female officers at Rattlesnake. "You're going to collapse if you keep this up." "I can't slow down," Dot replied, rubbing her tired eyes. "The proposal has to reach right field next week, or it'll miss the next review cycle. That means another 3 months before anyone sees it and 3 more months of tail gunners dying over Europe." Sarah sat down across from her. "I understand, believe me, but you're no good to anyone if you work yourself into a hospital bed. Besides, you've already proven your system works. The data from the training exercise was exceptional." "Exceptional results on paper don't mean anything if I can't get the proposal approved." Dot gestured at the stacks of documents around her. "Every I has to be dotted, every T crossed. One mistake, one missing specification, and they'll use it as an excuse to reject the whole thing." What Dot didn't tell Sarah was that she'd received a letter from Miller's brother, Tommy. Miller had written to him about the mirror system, and Tommy had written back with desperate hope in every line. "If there's something that can help us see them coming," he'd written, "please make it happen. We lost another crew last week. Good men. The tail gunner never even got a shot off." That letter sat in Dot's footlocker, and she read it every night before sleeping. It reminded her why she couldn't give up, couldn't slow down, couldn't accept anything less than success. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One afternoon, as Dot was testing the optical alignment of a new mirror configuration, Captain James Thornton walked into her workspace. Thornton was a B-17 pilot who'd flown 15 missions over Europe before being rotated back to the States as an instructor. He walked with a slight limp, courtesy of German flak over the Ruhr Valley. "Sergeant Winters, may I have a moment?" Dot stood and saluted. "Of course, sir." Thornton waved off the formality. "I've been hearing about your mirror system. Word's gotten around among the flight crews. I wanted to see it for myself." Dot showed him the prototype, explaining the principles and demonstrating how the mirrors expanded the tail gunner's field of view. Thornton listened intently, asking intelligent questions about angles, reflection quality, and installation procedures. "This is remarkable," he said finally. "Simple, elegant, and exactly what we need. Why hasn't this been implemented already?" "I'm working on the approval process, sir, but it's slow going." Thornton's expression hardened. Slow going because of bureaucracy or slow going because of prejudice? Dot chose her words carefully, Perhaps some of both, sir. Let me be blunt, Sergeant. I've flown combat missions. I've watched good men die because our defensive gunnery couldn't keep up with German fighters. I don't care if this innovation came from a woman, a man, or a trained chimpanzee. If it works, we need it. He paused. I have friends at Wright Field, officers who care more about saving lives than protecting egos. If you'll allow me, I'd like to add my endorsement to your proposal and send it through additional channels. Sir, I would be grateful for any support. Consider it done, but I'm also going to need something from you. What's that, sir? I want to test your system in a real training scenario. Not just one plane, but a full formation. Put your mirrors on every tail gun in a squadron and run them through the toughest combat simulation we can create. If it works as well as I think it will, we'll have the proof we need to ram this through any bureaucratic resistance. Dot felt hope surge in her chest. That would be perfect, sir, but Master Sergeant Holloway would never approve. Master Sergeant Holloway doesn't have the authority to approve or deny flight operations. That authority rests with squadron commanders and base commanders. Let me handle Holloway. You focus on getting enough mirror systems built for a full squadron test. Over the next week, Dot worked feverishly to construct additional mirror assemblies. Corporal Jackson recruited other mechanics to help, working in shifts around the clock. They built 12 complete systems, enough for an entire bomber squadron. Word of the upcoming test spread through the base. Young gunners, eager for any advantage that might keep them alive, volunteered enthusiastically. Pilots, having heard Captain Thornton's endorsement, pushed their crews to participate. Even some of the skeptical instructors began to show interest. Holloway watched these developments with barely concealed fury. He'd been outmaneuvered, his authority undermined, and there was nothing he could do about it without directly defying Colonel Harrison or the squadron commanders. But Dot could see the hatred in his eyes every time they crossed paths. "You're making a mistake, Winters," he told her one evening as she was leaving the hangar. "This thing is going to fail, and when it does, everyone's going to remember that it was your idea, your failure. You'll be finished." Dot met his gaze steadily. "If I'm wrong, Master Sergeant, I'll accept the consequences, but I'm not wrong." The day of the squadron test arrived. 12 B-17s sat on the tarmac, each equipped with Dot's mirror system. 12 tail gunners climbed into their positions, nervous but excited. A full squadron of P-51 fighters waited to play the role of enemy aircraft, with orders to make their attack runs as realistic and aggressive as possible. Colonel Harrison, Captain Thornton, and a dozen other officers gathered to observe. Even Holloway was there, standing apart from the others, his arms crossed and his expression sour. Dot stood with her binoculars and stopwatch, her stomach in knots. This was it. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd sacrificed, came down to the next hour. The bombers took off in formation, climbing to 15,000 feet. The P-51s circled above, waiting for the signal to begin their attack runs. Over the radio, Dot could hear the pilots and gunners running through their pre-combat checks. "Ground control, this is Blue Leader," came Captain Reeves's voice. "Fighters in position, ready to commence attack simulation." "Blue Leader, you are cleared hot. Commence attack runs at will." The P-51s dove. Through her binoculars, Dot watched the tail gunners track the incoming fighters. She started her stopwatch, her hands trembling. The first wave of P-51s came in from high 6 o'clock, diving out of the sun. In unison, all 12 tail gunners called out target acquisition, their voices overlapping on the radio. "Target acquired. Got him tracking. Guns on target." The acquisition times were phenomenal. Every tail gunner spotted the fighters at least 4 seconds earlier than baseline standards. Their guns tracked smoothly, maintaining firing solutions throughout the attack run. The P-51s pulled up and away, then regrouped for another attack. This time they came in from low angles, harder to spot and track. Again, the tail gunners performed brilliantly. Their increased field of view allowed them to pick up the fighters early and maintain situational awareness throughout the engagement. The simulation continued for 45 minutes, with attack runs from every conceivable angle. Each time the results were the same: earlier acquisition, better tracking, higher simulated hit percentages. When the planes finally landed, the crews emerged buzzing with excitement. The tail gunners gathered around Dot, speaking over each other in their enthusiasm. "Ma'am, that was incredible. I could see everything." I felt like I had eyes in the back of my head. Those fighters didn't stand a chance. Private Miller, his face flushed with adrenaline, pushed through the crowd. Ma'am, it worked even better than during our first test. I felt completely in control up there, like I actually had a chance. Colonel Harrison approached with Captain Thornton. The colonel's face was thoughtful, revealing nothing. Sergeant Winters, walk with me. They moved away from the crowd, toward the edge of the airfield. Dot's heart pounded. This was the moment that would determine everything. I've been in the military a long time, Colonel Harrison said, watching a B-17 taxi toward a hangar. I've seen a lot of innovations come and go. Most of them don't work as advertised. The ones that do usually come from established research teams with years of experience and substantial funding. Yes, sir. What I just witnessed was the single most significant improvement in defensive gunnery performance I've ever seen. Your mirror system doesn't just work, Sergeant Winters. It works exceptionally well. He turned to face her. I'm recommending immediate implementation across all bomber training programs, with a rush order for production units to be installed on combat aircraft in Europe and the Pacific. Dot felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me, you did this. Against opposition, against prejudice, against a system designed to ignore innovations from people who don't fit the expected mold. You persevered and you proved yourself right. He paused. But understand something, Sergeant. This is only the beginning. Getting approval is one thing, implementation is another. There will be more resistance, more skepticism, more people trying to take credit or tear you down. Are you prepared for that? I am, sir. Good, because I'm also recommending you for promotion to Technical Sergeant and assigning you as lead engineer for the production and deployment program. You'll oversee installation training, quality control, and field implementation. It's going to be a lot of work. I'm ready, sir. Colonel Harrison smiled. I believe you are dismissed, Sergeant. As Dot walked back toward the celebrating crowd, she saw Holloway standing alone, watching her with an unreadable expression. For a moment, their eyes met. Then Holloway turned and walked away without a word. Dot didn't feel triumphant, exactly. She felt relieved, exhausted, and deeply aware of the responsibility she now carried. Her innovation would save lives, but only if she could ensure it was implemented properly, if she could overcome the remaining resistance, if she could see this through to the end. But as she looked at the young faces around her, the tail gunners who would soon head into combat with a better chance of survival because of her work, she knew she would do whatever it took. 3 months later, Dot stood in a factory in Detroit, watching the production line. Workers assembled mirror systems based on her designs, dozens per day, each one destined for a bomber somewhere in the world. The military had approved her system for immediate widespread deployment, and the manufacturing had been fast-tracked with highest priority. Technical Sergeant Dorothy Winters was now one of the most important engineering specialists in the Army Air Forces. She traveled to bases across the country, training installation crews and giving lectures on proper use of the mirror system. She'd visited Wright Field to work with engineers on refinements and improvements. She'd even been interviewed for military publications, though the articles carefully downplayed her gender, focusing instead on the innovation itself. The letters from overseas had started arriving 6 weeks earlier. Tail gunners who'd received the mirror systems wrote to express their gratitude. Pilots wrote to confirm that their defensive capabilities had improved dramatically. One letter, from a crew in England, reported that their tail gunner had shot down 2 German fighters in a single mission, crediting the mirror system with giving him the edge he needed. But the letter that meant the most to Dot came from Tommy Miller, Private Miller's brother. He was still alive, still flying missions, and his crew had just received the mirror system installation. I don't know if you'll ever read this, Sergeant Winters, he'd written, but my little brother told me about you and what you did. You gave us a fighting chance. You gave us hope. Whatever happens to me now, I'll know I had every advantage possible. Thank you doesn't seem like enough, but thank you. Dot had that letter in her pocket now as she watched the production line. She thought about all the Tommy Millers flying missions over Europe and the Pacific, about all the young men who would come home because they could see danger coming a few seconds earlier. A voice interrupted her thoughts. Sergeant Winters, there's someone here to see you. Dot turned to find a young lieutenant waiting nearby. Who is it, Lieutenant? He wouldn't say, ma'am, just that it was important. Curious, Dot followed the lieutenant to a small office near the factory floor. Inside, she found Master Sergeant Frank Holloway waiting. He stood when she entered, his face weathered and tired. "Master Sergeant," Dot said formally, "this is a surprise." "I'm sure it is," Holloway gestured to a chair. "Sit down, Sergeant Winters, please." Dot sat wary. Holloway remained standing for a moment, seeming to struggle with something. Finally, he sat across from her. "I owe you an apology," he said abruptly. Dot blinked in surprise. "Sir, I treated you poorly from the moment you arrived at Rattlesnake. I dismissed your ideas, I obstructed your work, and I made it clear that I didn't think women belonged in the military. I was wrong." He pulled an envelope from his pocket. "This arrived yesterday, from my nephew Harold. He's a tail gunner on a B-17 out of England." Holloway opened the envelope with shaking hands and pulled out a letter. "Harold writes that his crew was hit hard last week. 2 German fighters came in from behind, guns blazing. He says the mirror system you designed saved his life. He saw them coming early enough to get off a burst that drove them away. His exact words were, 'Tell whoever invented this system that they're a genius, and I owe them everything.'" The old sergeant's voice cracked slightly. "That's my sister's boy, her only son. If something happened to him because I was too stubborn and prejudiced to give your innovation a fair chance." He trailed off, unable to finish. Dot sat in silence for a moment. "Master Sergeant, I appreciate you telling me this, but you don't owe me an apology for your nephew's safety. You owe it to yourself and to all the people whose potential you might overlook in the future because they don't match your expectations." Holloway nodded slowly. "You're right, and you're wise beyond your years, Sergeant Winters." He stood. "I won't take any more of your time. I just needed you to know that I was wrong about you, wrong about women in the military, and wrong about a lot of other things. I'm going to do better." He saluted, and this time it was genuine, filled with respect. Dot returned the salute, and Holloway left. After he'd gone, Dot sat alone in the small office, processing what had just happened. It wasn't a complete victory. There were still many men like Holloway who would need to learn the same lesson. But it was progress, and sometimes progress came one person at a time, one mind changed at a time. A month later, Dot received orders to report to Washington, D.C. She traveled by train, watching the country pass by her window, wondering what this new assignment would bring. When she arrived at the War Department building, she was escorted to a conference room where several high-ranking officers waited. "Technical Sergeant Winters, please be seated," said a colonel she didn't recognize. "We've been reviewing reports on your mirror system. The results have exceeded all expectations. Tail gunner accuracy has increased by an average of 295%. More importantly, casualty rates among tail gunners have decreased by 42% in the 3 months since deployment began." Dot felt a surge of emotion but kept her expression professional. "I'm gratified to hear that, sir. The War Department wants to expand your role. We need more innovations like yours, practical, effective, implementable. We're creating a new division focused on equipment improvement based on input from field personnel. We'd like you to lead the defensive systems section." It was an extraordinary opportunity, a chance to influence not just one system but potentially dozens. But Dot thought about what it would mean. More time in offices, more time away from the young men and women who needed the innovations, more bureaucracy to navigate. "Sir, I'm honored by the offer, but may I make a counter-proposal?" The colonel raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." "Rather than lead from Washington, I'd like to continue working in the field. I want to visit combat units overseas, talk to the crews actually using the equipment, and identify other problems that need solving. I can send reports back to your new division, but I believe I'll be more effective close to the people I'm trying to help." The officers exchanged glances. Finally, the colonel nodded. "That's an unusual request, but given your track record, we're inclined to grant it. You'll be assigned as a roving technical liaison with authority to visit any Army Air Forces installation in any theater of operations. You'll have the rank and resources necessary to conduct field research and implement solutions. Acceptable?" "More than acceptable, sir. Thank you." 2 weeks later, Technical Sergeant Dorothy Winters boarded a C-47 transport plane bound for England. Her orders gave her access to bomber bases across the United Kingdom, and she planned to spend the next several months visiting tail gunners, observing their challenges, and looking for other innovations that could save lives. She arrived at an airbase in East Anglia on a cold, gray morning. The base commander met her personally, clearly having been instructed to provide full cooperation. Sergeant Winters, welcome to the 8th Air Force. The men are eager to meet you. The men, sir. The tail gunners. Word's gotten around about who designed the mirror system. They've been asking to meet you since we heard you were coming. That afternoon, Dot stood in a briefing room packed with tail gunners from multiple squadrons. They ranged in age from barely 20 to mid-30s, faces marked by stress and exhaustion from constant combat missions. When Dot entered, they stood as one and applauded. "At ease, gentlemen," Dot said, her voice wavering slightly with emotion. "Please sit down." They sat, and the room fell silent. Dot looked out at these young men, knowing that many of them wouldn't survive the war despite her innovation. The mirror system improved their odds, but it couldn't eliminate the danger they faced every day. "I'm here to listen," Dot said. "Tell me about your experiences with the mirror system. Tell me what works, what doesn't work, and what other challenges you're facing. I can't promise I'll solve every problem, but I can promise I'll try." For the next hour, they talked. They praised the mirror system enthusiastically, sharing stories of enemy fighters spotted early and attacks repelled successfully. But they also talked about other issues: communication problems between crew members, difficulties with ammunition loading in extreme cold, vision problems from prolonged high-altitude flight. Dot took notes on everything, her mind already working on potential solutions. This was where she belonged, she realized. Not in an office in Washington, not even in a safe training base stateside. Here, with the people who needed help the most, the people she'd joined the military to serve. As the meeting broke up, a young tail gunner approached her. He couldn't have been more than 21, with red hair and freckles that made him look even younger. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant Harold Holloway." Dot's eyes widened. "Master Sergeant Holloway's nephew." "Yes, ma'am. He wrote to me, told me about meeting you in Detroit. I wanted to thank you personally. Your mirror system saved my life and probably saved it again since then. I don't know if I'll make it through this war, but I know I've got a better chance because of what you did." Dot shook his hand, blinking back tears. "Your uncle's a good man, Sergeant Holloway, and you're brave to be here doing this. We're all scared, ma'am, but knowing that people like you are working to help us, that makes it a little easier." That evening, Dot sat in her quarters writing in her journal. She thought about her journey from the small town in Michigan where she'd grown up, through all the skepticism and obstacles to this moment. She thought about her father, who taught her that innovation came from seeing what others missed and having the courage to pursue it. She wrote, "Today I met young men who thank me for helping them survive. Some of them won't make it home. That's the terrible truth of war. But some of them will survive who wouldn't have otherwise, and that has to be enough. Tomorrow I start working on solutions to the other problems they've told me about. The work continues." 6 months later, Dot had developed and implemented 3 more innovations: an improved communication system that reduced radio interference, a heating modification for guns that prevented freezing at high altitude, and a simplified ammunition loading mechanism that cut reload time in half. Each innovation went through proper channels now, each was tested rigorously, and each was deployed with full official support. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. By that time, Dot's mirror system had been installed on over 15,000 bombers. Conservative estimates suggested it had saved over 3,000 lives and contributed to hundreds of enemy aircraft destroyed. When the war ended, Dot was offered a permanent position in the newly forming United States Air Force. She accepted, continuing her work on innovations and equipment improvement. She never married, devoting herself instead to her work and the people who depended on it. In 1955, now a major, Dorothy Winters was awarded the Legion of Merit for her contributions to aerial combat systems. At the ceremony, she was surrounded by former tail gunners, pilots, and crew members whose lives had been touched by her innovations. Harold Holloway was there, now a middle-aged man with children of his own. So was Private James Miller, who'd survived the war and become a commercial pilot. But the person Dot thought about most during the ceremony was her father, the small-town optician who taught her to see the world differently. She wished he could have been there to see what his lessons had made possible. In her acceptance speech, Dot said, "This medal represents the efforts of countless people who refused to accept that things had to stay the way they'd always been. It represents every young person who's ever had an idea and been told it was impossible. It represents everyone who's ever been underestimated or overlooked because they didn't fit someone's expectations. And most importantly, it represents the thousands of men who went into combat with better tools because someone was willing to listen to a new idea. She paused, looking out at the audience. Innovation doesn't come from rank or status or gender. It comes from observation, dedication, and the refusal to accept unnecessary loss of life. If my story has a message, it's this: never underestimate anyone. The person with the solution to your biggest problem might be standing right in front of you if only you're willing to listen. The applause lasted for several minutes, and in that moment, Dorothy Winters knew that her father would have been proud. Years later, when historians studied the improvements in bomber defensive systems during World War II, they would recognize Dot's mirror system as one of the most significant tactical innovations of the war. They would note that it came not from a major research institution or a team of experienced engineers, but from a young woman who saw a problem and refused to accept that nothing could be done about it. But the real legacy of Dorothy Winters wasn't measured in statistics or historical footnotes. It was measured in the lives saved, the men who came home, and the families that stayed whole. It was measured in the changed minds of people like Frank Holloway, who learned to look past their prejudices. And it was measured in the generations of innovators who came after, who learned that good ideas could come from anyone, anywhere, if only someone was willing to listen. The mirror system itself remained in use for years after the war, even as jet aircraft began to replace propeller-driven bombers. Modern versions, adapted and improved, could be found on military aircraft well into the 21st century. And though few people remembered the name Dorothy Winters, her innovation continued to save lives long after she was gone. But that cold afternoon in England, standing before a room full of grateful young men who'd been given a fighting chance because of her work, Dorothy Winters had already received the only recognition she truly needed: the knowledge that she'd made a difference, that her father's lessons had borne fruit, and that she'd proven, once and for all, that innovation and courage knew no gender. The gunner's genius mirror hack had tripled tailgun accuracy. But more than that, it had opened minds, saved lives, and changed history. And it all began with one woman who refused to accept that things had to stay the way they'd always been.